Coming up as camp rolls on, one, Darius Slayton is officially back in the building. Why is he a lightning rod for the fan base? What does his impact mean inside of the wide receiver room? And was there, once upon a time, a version where Malik Nabers was a Minnesota Viking? We dive in on it all coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're talking New York Football Giants, and we're also talking about how today's episode is brought to you by Personam. Personam is an online threat detection engine for your business, and it simply looks into cyber threats that other platforms and services cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. Check out Personam today. And Andy, what we're checking out is a man in camp. Darius Slayton back in the mix for the New York Football Giants. We speculated that this was the wrong offseason to draw a line in the sand and say you wanted to get more money from the team. Ultimately, it sounded like Joe Shane, Brian Dable, nobody looked like they were moving the needle on this. He gets himself back into camp, but it seems to have created some level of animosity among the fan base that you and I can't quite figure out.
Yeah, it is interesting because the comments that you see on X and other places on social media are basically saying Darius Slayton isn't good enough to do this. He's not the type of player that should be holding out for more money. What is he thinking? Like he only had 700 yards last season. Like what leg does he have to stand on? The Giants have all the leverage. And it is interesting. I saw Ryan Dunleavy of the New York Post and others come out and be like, I don't understand why the Giants fan base like hates their own players. Like it's
Yeah.
You know what it is, Adam? I think the only thing I can rationalize is that people think that it's taking money out of their own pockets that Darius Slayton is asking for it. Because why would you care if the guy is asking for a pay raise that I think probably is deserved given what you see in the market and the production and all the other things with Darius Slayton involved?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just by the numbers, right? So you can debate whether or not a fifth round pick who's been pretty consistent, has certainly had his ups and downs when it comes to catch percentages and drops, right? But has been a good player. It's weird how he seems to, and there's probably more players on the roster that fall into this category too, but where like he gets siloed out. When you talk about if you're, say, a Daniel Jones defender, right? Well, because of the offensive line, because this was a bad team, that's why he struggled. If you were a Saquon Barkley, very high level pick, high expectations for Saquon Barkley, obviously. But it's, oh, well, yeah, we didn't do him any services because he played behind a crappy line, bad coaching, everything changed. When were you ever going to have enough weapons so that he could be productive? You put all of it on his back. But then you get to a fifth round pick, and it seems to be like maybe because there wasn't high expectations coming in, he's been a good, serviceable player. You're not talking about, top 15 wide receiver or something, but you look at him and go, yeah, he's been solid. He's been good. And somehow this association of wide receiver market money has come up. We're going to talk about that more in today's episode. But he looked around. Hey, based on my production, I'm deserving of probably a better salary here. And if I don't try to get it sooner than later, I know what happens. I play out my contract and I end up on the free agent market, and I'm trying to convince other teams that I had that requisite value. So I don't know. I don't know why that gets created in that way, where talent seems to breed a willingness to defend or to create the excuses, whereas we don't apply the same thing to Darius Slayton. Well, what if you had a Malik Nabers for his entire career? Don't we think that Darius Slayton would have been a better receiver if he was playing as a 2 or 3 on an NFL roster? Of course he would have been.
Yeah, to me, it's kind of wild. Like he's led the Giants in receiving yards 4 of the last 5 years, and the counter argument is, well, the Giants wide receiver room hasn't been good, and if
Of
you're the
course.
best of the worst, what does that mean? And it's like, well, I know what it means at the very least, and that is he can be a productive wide receiver in the NFL.
Right.
He can make big plays. In his career, he's averaged over 15 yards per catch. Like that is explosive, can get downfield. That would rank him in the top 15, according to last season in terms of yards per catch.
Yep.
Darius Slayton is a productive wide receiver. He's only 27 years old. He's looking for more security. Remember, he took a pay cut to come back to the Giants last year when his market didn't develop. Had another solid yet unspectacular season last year. And now he's looking and saying, I have no financial security after this year. I'm basically guaranteed $6 million this year. for a player on the open market this season, my salary would probably be $10 million, right?
Right.
Like you look at Gabe Davis getting $13 million. Darius Slayton might be a notch below him. Some people might say they're the same. But Darius Slayton asking for a couple million more or a longer term deal for some security is a reasonable thing to me. I'm glad that he's in camp, Adam. And it's not like the Giants are like world beaters in the wide receiver room where we can just jettison productive players that are under the age of 30 years old.
No, and I'm going through it right now. And you look over at it. I was just about to get to. He's like in the mid 30s here, maybe closer to 40 in terms of total contract salary, and then on average AAV, he's making $6 million a year. By the way, Malik Nabers will slot in 7.3 million as a rookie. So just, it's also the fun reminder. We believe in Malik Nabers, and you believe in all of these guys. That's why they are viewed this way when it comes in the NFL draft. But he is sitting there as a rookie walking in the door. He's going to make $7.3 million. His total contract is $29.2 million. Darius Slayton, at 27 years old, having had some productive seasons, is saying, hey, I'm making about $6 million. He's right behind Rashad Bateman, who's making $6.4 million. He's just ahead of Rome Odunze, a rookie. Drake London on a rookie contract. Khalif Raymond for the Lions making $5.2 million. Like, when you start to look at some of these guys around it, whether it's rookies, obviously those numbers are going to get skewed a little bit, or some of the ones that you talk about, Kendrick Bourne, who now is going to be making at 29 years old, $6.5 million with the New England Patriots. It's just like, hey, I can make a case that he's kind of slotted where he should be. As a few more contracts come through here, we're going to see him get bumped down a little bit. For me, it comes down to the Giants, right? So let's get beyond the money here in a lot of ways to the point that you just made. When you look inside the New York Football Giants, we understand over the long term. 2 years from now, are we talking about Darius Slayton being a player that you want to make sure is a part of this roster? No, we're not going to be. Another 2 draft classes, another 2 free agent classes potentially, and another 2 years for your roster overall to develop. Malik Nabers, we expect him to be a number 1. We expect him to make an impact immediately. We've had that discussion already this offseason. Jalen Hyatt, hey, big expectations. Yes, 3rd round wide receiver, but based on talent, was a 1st round graded prospect. And then you have Wan'Dale Robinson, who I think, at least you as well, the yardage doesn't suggest it, but I believe that he had a sneakily productive season in a lot of key metrics, and you can expect him to take a step forward. So 2 years from now, we're talking about 3 wide receivers, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd round values, building out this rotation for the New York Football Giants. But right now, you have inexperience, still developing. And when you look at the rest of the wide receiver room, you see like a lot of guys. You see names, and not names that really are going to bring any level of confidence in terms of saying, Darius Slayton, how dare you ask for more money as your contract is winding down? We'll go with player X. We're going to get into who those players are here, but that's it. He's your 4th best option in the wide receiver room, and with good reason.
Well, Adam, the other thing that really surprises me about all this
Like, I'm a bit of
is
a rant today.
basically like look at the guys around him in terms of production, and you can understand why Darius Slayton feels the way that he does. Cortland Sutton is 28 years old. Cortland Sutton had 772 yards compared to Darius Slayton's 770. So they're a year apart. They're about 5 yards difference. And Cortland Sutton's making $14.5 million a year.
Yeah.
You look at Jerry Jeudy, who had about the same type of production as Darius Slayton. He actually had 12 yards less. Jerry Jeudy is making $13 million a year this year.
Right.
You look at Christian Kirk, who obviously hit free agency, got a nice deal with the Jaguars. He's got a cap hit of $24 million. I think he's making $17 million. So when you see Darius Slayton is kind of lumped in between guys like Sutton and Jeudy and Kirk, who are anywhere between, Gabe Davis just got his contract,
right,
albeit a year or 2 younger than Darius Slayton.
Of course.
Darius Slayton had the same amount of yards as Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis is making $13 million. So when you think about it in the grand scheme, all the guys around Darius Slayton's production and age are making anywhere between $12.5 and $16.5 million. Darius Slayton's making $6.5, and he's saying something doesn't add up here. So it's understandable for him to say, get me a little bit better. Get me closer to where they're at. Like, it makes no sense that I'm making half of what the guys' production around me is in terms of the same age and yardage.
And let's, coming up here in a second, talk about the bigger conversation, which is the wide receiver room as a whole. If you don't want to pay Darius Slayton, and you don't need to, he's under contract. Who do you believe is ready to step up in that room? We'll talk about what is a hodgepodge of veterans and young talent alike. How is this room going to build out? On top of which, later on, a little conversation about the draft and how maybe, just maybe, the Minnesota Vikings wanted to derail Joe Shane's perfect agenda at the top. We'll get into that in just one moment. So as we continue today's One Giant podcast, we let you know today's episode is also brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. That spells Pietential. It's an online assessment tool, free survey for individual users that sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to make progress, and also tracks that progress over time. No matter you're talking about starting your rookie campaign like Malik Nabers is, or just trying to be a consistent, productive, even-keeled kind of individual day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Get over to Pietential today and start getting your well-being on track. Andy, speaking of being on track, okay, this conversation really isn't just about Darius Slayton. It's also about the wide receiver room as a whole. We mentioned Malik Nabers, Wan'Dale Robinson. We mentioned Jalen Hyatt. Those are the big ones. After Darius Slayton, we're taking a look at a veteran who just a couple of years ago was looking for a big contract in Allen Robinson. Don't know if he's making it out of camp or not. We'll see. Brought in Isaiah McKenzie to compete maybe for a special teams role and be a backup player in the mix as well. Isaiah Hodgins is, of course, the darling from the practice squad of Buffalo to a starting rotation player for the New York Football Giants 2 seasons ago. Bryce Ford-Wheaton, maybe my personal favorite, along with a lot of other names like Miles Boykins and Chase Cota. It's just when you go through that room, man, if you want this team to be successful this year, go ahead and pick out a name in there that you would have more confidence in than you would in Darius Slayton right now.
Yeah, this is the whole point of why I don't understand why people want to run Darius Slayton out of town. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, the only way, well, I'll start first with the wide receiver room.
Talk to me.
Darius Slayton is arguably the most accomplished in the wide receiver room. I don't think that's even a hot take. Jalen Hyatt had like 3 games where he was basically starting. You look at Wan'Dale Robinson, who came off an injury, had less yards than Darius Slayton, and Malik Nabers has never played a snap in the NFL. Now, Allen Robinson has had a very productive career 4 or 5 years ago, but we haven't seen that explosiveness since. And then you have guys like Isaiah McKenzie who have been carved out roles as a special teamer. Gunnar Olszewski, Bryce Ford-Wheaton got injured. When you look at that room, Adam, Darius Slayton is important because he's the only one that has production recently that you can point to say, we know at the very least Darius Slayton is in the prime of his career and he can, without fail, you can put him up there for 700 yards. Like that's what he's done in his career every single year. And he is that security blanket that the Giants desperately need. And so for me, it's crazy that everyone wants to run him out of town. Now, what I will say with that, though,
here we go.
The only way that I think that this makes sense is not to diminish the player that Darius Slayton is, but if you were going to say, we think that we can get 80% of what Darius Slayton does with the complement of these guys in this room, whether it's Isaiah Hodgins at a veteran deal, whether it's Bryce Ford-Wheaton emerges, and you want to reallocate that $6 million of Darius Slayton spend into the secondary, into an interior offensive lineman, into a tight end, whatever it may be, then I can maybe understand like the idea of reallocation, but the idea of just jettisoning Darius Slayton for nothing just because you don't like that he's asked for a contract demand is kind of frankly silly to me.
Yeah, now that's a different kind of conversation. Most of what we're hearing is like Darius Slayton, how dare he, right? Rather than what it really comes down to is where might we improve this team in different ways. So you mentioned a couple of names there, and I'm going to get to Bryce Ford-Wheaton in a second, who I believe does have a path to carve out a role for himself. But let's use Isaiah Hodgins, right? 2 years ago, he comes in off the practice squad. We get it really excited about it. Plays 8 games, 33 catches on 42 targets, 351 yards, over 10 yards per clip, 4 touchdowns. And you think, hey, maybe mostly a compliment to the offensive system. Look, we can take guys that we had some familiarity in Buffalo with, bring them in, and they can immediately carve out a role. Fast forward a year later, nothing dramatically changed. Yes, they drafted Jalen Hyatt, but Jalen Hyatt didn't see a ton of the field. And again, we expect him to take a big leap forward here. When you fast forward a year later, it was 17 games for Isaiah Hodgins, 21 catches on 33 targets, 230 yards, 3 touchdowns. He still has this red zone kind of value, 100%. But what I think, at least for me, I don't know if you agree, I was surprised and then also recalibrated accordingly. Okay, Isaiah Hodgins clearly internally is not viewed as a guy that is capable of doing enough of all the things that you want him to do. Now, maybe it changes based on offensive line because Isaiah Hodgins isn't the fastest wide receiver in the world. And with a little bit more time and route development, some of these guys are going to see a little bit more success. It's not a knock on Isaiah Hodgins. But in my mind, when I look at it and you look at rep breakdown and snap counts last year, you go, yeah, Darius Slayton, as a holdover from a previous regime, was clearly, based on talent in the room and expectations, more capable and trusted by the coaching staff to go out and execute on a down over down, opportunity, unlike a guy like Isaiah Hodgins. Otherwise, why wouldn't Isaiah Hodgins be in the mix all season long last year? It ended up being a very much a, hey, you're kind of getting buried here, and we'll see if you get opportunities as we move along.
It's a little bit of a shame because in 2022, when Isaiah Hodgins came to the Giants, Isaiah Hodgins had the highest catch rate of any wide receiver in the NFL. When a ball was thrown to him, he did his job and he did it very, very well, which is why everyone had such
That
high
was so
expectations.
tantalizing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's capitalizing on all the opportunities. Just to frame it, you may say, what is catch rate, Andy? Number 2 on that list was Cooper Kupp. Number 4 on that list was Keenan Allen. You're talking about guys that when the ball gets thrown to them, you
Yeah.
can rely on them consistently. Like,
And obviously massive volume for those type of players, right? We're not staking the claim here. And that's why Isaiah Hodgins is on par with them. But on his sample size, he did his job, which to your point is like, hey, did your job. It's one of the things I point to with when we talk about Wan'Dale Robinson. Hey, yardage is low, but guess what? When you throw the ball his way, he catches the football. That's the number one objective here for the position.
yeah, Keenan Allen is considered a great possession type wide receiver. Cooper Kupp, obviously awesome at what he does. And the whole point is like they're making $20 to $25 million a year. You have Isaiah Hodgins on a minimum deal, and he's catching everything that you want. So there is a world where I see Isaiah Hodgins as like the possession, sturdy hand type of guy. He certainly does not have the explosiveness of a Darius Slayton or a Jalen Hyatt or Malik Nabers, but I think he can carve out a role in this wide receiver room, albeit you feel like his ceiling is limited. I think to your point on Bryce Ford Wheaton, we don't really know what the downside is, but I think we can both agree that the upside of what Bryce Ford Wheaton could do, we think is higher than whatever Isaiah Hodgins can do. So the question is more like, what do you need in this room? Do you need a steady hand that's going to be able to get you a first down, or do you need an explosive wide receiver that may be able to take the top off, big body guy, aggressive up in the air? Like, I think it's all about how you complement the wide receiver room on what roles all of these wide receivers can play.
Yeah, of course. When you bring up a guy like Bryce Ford Wheaton, who obviously has the injury concerns, and now we're having the conversation, right? What is it going to look like for him if he can be 100% healthy? Where's the confidence level around him? Which, by the way, I'll go right back to Darius Slayton just as a little note. Guys almost always on the field and available. That's something the Giants have struggled with just universally. So when you think about the wide receiver room, you also factor that in as well. But for a guy in Bryce Ford Wheaton, 5.85 prospect grade coming out of the NFL draft, athletic score, off the charts at an 85 coming out of the combine there, runs a 4.38 vertical. It's not hard to squint when you think about, okay, how do you want to build out this room? Let's assume that Darius Slayton is going to live on this current contract, and maybe he gets traded, maybe he just plays it out, whatever the case may be. In behind him, I think the dream for the Giants would be Bryce Ford Wheaton shows up in camp, looks good, understands the system, gets the route tree combinations, and showcases that he can be the replacement to be a field stretcher on the outside for Darius Slayton at a much lower cost. And then we get to dance and play with Jalen Hyatt and Wan'Dale Robinson and Malik Nabers. I think that's the dream here for the New York Football Giants. Like, before we talk about what happened on the market this offseason for wide receiver coming up here in a second, and talk about what happened in the draft for the New York Football Giants, or almost happened, do you agree that when you look inside this room, and the Giants took some shots here on some, always bringing guys to camp, and you're going to get, camp invites, etc. Practice squad will obviously be a factor here. Do you agree that the quote ideal version of things for the New York Football Giants coming out of this would be that Bryce Ford Wheaton, that their room looks like Malik Nabers, Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, obviously, and then that it is Bryce Ford Wheaton comes back healthy, looks good, and claims a spot, that you do have Darius Slayton right there, and maybe you start to have some trade fodder conversations at some point to improve this team elsewhere. And then you worry about what happens with some guys claiming roles, special teams, Isaiah McKinney, Gunner obviously in the mix there as well, right? Like, does that check for you that the Giants version of this would be, successful, would be Bryce Ford Wheaton getting up into that fifth, maybe trying to, tease the fourth wide receiver position on this roster?
Yeah, maybe. I kind of look at it like Allen
Or I should
Robinson.
say a lot of fours, right? 1, 2, 3, and then like 3 or 4 guys. Because you can make the case for, I think, a lot of players here. But I think that that's the version the Giants would be content with, where a lot of guys are capable of playing that role. Isaiah Hodgins included in that group as well.
If Darius Slayton does not get traded, there's 4 guaranteed wide receivers on this roster.
Yes.
Guaranteed, right? Darius Slayton, Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, and Malik Nabers. No
Yep.
matter what happens in camp, those 4 will be on there if Darius Slayton does not get traded. To me, that opens up basically 2 spots, I would say, that if the Giants carry 6 wide receivers. It feels like, to me, Allen Robinson and Isaiah Hodgins would be battling for one of those spots because of the type of skill set that they both have. Like, what Allen Robinson isn't a speed guy anymore. He's more of a possession guy. That's really where, Isaiah Hodgins really steps up. I think that's kind of the complement of which one looks a little bit better. You got one that's a little bit younger that knows the system, and older veteran presence that's in the room in Allen Robinson. Then the question kind of comes up to me of the Giants really screwed up the special teams piece of things last year when they let Jamison Crowder go. And they tried Eric Gray, even though he had never caught a punt in his entire life. That was an unmitigated disaster.
No big deal.
The Giants have to make a decision. They have to decide, is Isaiah McKenzie or Gunnar Olszewski worthy of just being on the roster as the last wide receiver, or with the special teams role? Or can a guy like Tyrone Tracy be able to, take over all of the kick returning duties, knowing that he'll probably be on the roster? And then you have the wild card in Bryce Ford Wheaton. I just don't know until we actually see him on the field healthy, like catching balls and being aggressive. I think it's really tough to even count on anything from Bryce Ford Wheaton. So in my mind, I would say blow us away, claim the spot, Bryce Ford Wheaton. But really, in actuality, I'm thinking of the wide receiver room more in that regard of 4 guys locked in. Isaiah Hodgins and Allen Robinson are battling out. And the 6th one may go to a return specialist type guy that we could use in a pinch.
And this would be the case, like whether you feel slighted by the money that Darius Slayton makes or not, this would be the case for camp, is that between Allen Robinson, between Isaiah Hodgins, Bryce Ford Wheaton, even McKenzie, all these guys, that enough of these players show you enough that when you look at it, you go, if somebody wants to call us about Darius Slayton, we're willing to move on from him. I think that's the best version of this for the New York Football Giants would be, hey, enough players in the room, make it look viable that we can make a different decision about Darius Slayton if we want to, if an opportunity presents itself to improve the roster in another way. And to your point, if not, guess what? Darius Slayton's here. He's making $6 million, and he's a guaranteed lock at that number 4 wide receiver position, and certainly offers you some veteran experience. By the way, he's the most experienced wide receiver on the team and in the room in terms of this organization. He's the guy. So again, it's one of those, like, reward the players that have been here a little bit. And I don't mean with a new contract. It's just, hey, in a run that has been brutal for the New York Football Giants, why not enjoy the fact that Darius Slayton has kind of been a nice spot and a nice story, even if it feels like you're, angry and irritated over what he wants, which is just a little bit of security. Coming up here in a second, we're going to close out by talking about some interesting notes on the market in terms of players getting paid, like Nico Collins, how the market for wide receivers from a money standpoint may be coming down at just the wrong time for Darius Slayton to want a new contract. And what the heck happened in the draft? Could things have looked dramatically different? We close out looking back at Minnesota and what maybe was a blown opportunity for them, coming up here in just one moment. All right, as we tie a pretty little bow on the One Giant podcast, one note here, because you mentioned a name in Allen Robinson, and I'll just say, obviously, he's 30 years old, coming off of Pittsburgh, where he played in all 17 games, but 49 targets, 34 receptions. You know what's notable? Here are his drop totals going back to 2018 when he came into the league. 3, 7, 3, 2, 1. He does not drop the ball. You talk about, hey, when the ball comes your way, you secure that catch. He had just 3 drops in 2020 when he had 151 targets, 102 receptions, 1,250 yards. Obviously, the peak of his yardage powers, 5 touchdowns in that year. Now, does that mean that he's ever going to sniff the production level we saw even maybe a couple of years ago, 400 plus yards, 500 yards? I don't know. But that consistency and that experience is probably something that really matters here for the Giants, for Brian Daboll, for Mike Kafka. Hey, if we're keeping bodies around, goes for Isaiah Hodgins too. Be consistent. You're not the perfect. You're not the best. You're not the most athletic. If I throw you the ball, if you get a snap, you better catch the damn thing. And that's what I think you're seeing there. As you mentioned, Bryce Ford-Wheat and other young players. Hey, we've got guys that shown they can do this. You need to really prove that your upside, that your ceiling warrants keeping you around over some veteran players, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Allen Robinson feels more like a camp body to me than anything. If you
Of
look
course
at
he
it
does.
in 2020, he had 1,250 yards, which was an awesome year in year 27, when he was age 27. Since then, he has progressively had less yards,
Of course.
less targets, and almost less receptions in every single year. He went from 1,250 to 410 to 339 to 280. So
Yeah.
usually that trend does not change when you go from 27 to 30 years old. You're not going to generally have a resurgence. But listen, he's a veteran presence in the room. When if Darius Slayton leaves, he clearly is the only one that's almost over the age of 28 years old. You need some of these veterans to be able to guide some of these young guys anyway. Good for him. Hope that he's a good mentor for some of these players. Will be interesting to see if he has a real opportunity to make the roster.
And oh, by the way, two injured seasons in 21 and 22 for him, right? Able to be healthy this past year. Now, again, only 280 yards on 34 receptions. So we'll see how it plays out. And the QB rating was not as strong, 75.2 this past year. Year prior, 93.3. That's more in line with what he's been for his career. So 30-year-old wide receiver, we know what happens when you get to that age, but just notable, man. These are the things that you're watching for over the course of camp. Other things we're watching for, tie it back to the top. Darius Slayton wants a new contract. These players are not on the same caliber. But Nico Collins gets himself a contract extension, and I think there actually is a tie-in here, Andy, as they ink him to an additional 3 years, totaling $72 million.
Yep, 3 years, 72 with about $52 million guaranteed.
Lock it up.
And, at first glance, at first blush at this, I was like, wow, that's a lot of money for Nico Collins, right? Like
Right.
I was surprised at it. Now, I am of the mindset of you should always be investing in players that can grow rather than guys you've seen the top pinnacle in their prime that you're only going to get lesser of it. So
Right.
I understand the deal, but you can understand when Nico Collins is 25, he's a couple years younger than Darius Slayton. In 2022, with a hodgepodge of quarterbacks, he had 480 yards. And then last year with CJ Stroud, he had almost 1,300 yards and got his yards per catch up to 16.2. And they
Right.
basically said, we're going to have him grow along with CJ Stroud. We want to keep this group intact. What I find fascinating is, and this is more on the Houston side of things, is they brought in Stephon Diggs, who has a massive cap hit for this year, but restructured him so that he could be a free agent at the end of the year. They added on to Nico Collins' contract, where he only has a $3 million base, but then it balloons next year to what it should be. So they really have Stephon Diggs to try to see if they can get over the top. And then next year is when Nico Collins kicks in. They're flighting kind of the wide receiver contracts and when they hit the right way. But you can see Darius Slayton is saying, this is why I want more money. Because a guy like Nico Collins, yes, he had a better year last year than I have ever had. But even if you say that I'm half the player that he is, you're talking about I should get a pay raise of $3 or $4 million this season just on that alone. So you can understand why Darius Slayton sees all these contracts coming out. Never mind what Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CD Lamb, all these top end type players are going to be asking for $30 to $35 million a year. Darius Slayton saying, even if I'm a third of them, give me $10 million and I'm happy here. So you can understand when you see these contracts why players feel a certain type of way. I think getting Malik Nabers in the draft at the 6th pick
Oh, yeah.
allowed Joe Shane the ability to have these discussions and have way more flexibility, because if Malik Nabers was not available for the Giants at 6, Adam, it would drastically change Darius Slayton's leverage in this whole situation as well.
Oh, of course, right? We mentioned before. So Malik Nabers making over $7 million as a rookie. That cost the Giants something. More than willing to pay the tab for what they think is going to be a premier elite number 1 wide receiver. If they can't get him, though, all of a sudden the Darius Slayton contract, I think the extension would have been done. They would have said, we need this guy in this room with Jalen Hyatt and Wan'Dale Robinson. And guess what? That could have happened because the Minnesota Vikings were basically trying to reset their timeline. They were ready to start fielding offers on Jefferson. And the way to get there was getting themselves up to the 5th overall pick ahead of the New York Football Giants, getting Malik Nabers, and then opening up this opportunity to say, hey, we can start to reset our timeline with this dynamic duo of Sam Darnold and Malik Nabers potentially.
Yeah, the reports are all coming out a little bit from the NFL draft saying, the Minnesota Vikings took JJ McCarthy. They were sitting at 11. They ended up getting their quarterback of the future.
Of
But
course.
they really were trying to see if they could move up to 5 with the LA Chargers in order to draft Malik Nabers. Obviously, the Chargers said we want to build through the trenches. Joe Alt, they thought was generational. They didn't want to move off of it. But the theory was that the Minnesota Vikings wanted to move in front of the Giants, knowing the Giants probably wanted Malik Nabers. They already have an all pro, all world type of wide receiver in Justin
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson. And you may say, why? Why would you do that when you already have that spot locked
Why,
in?
Andy? Why?
And the answer is Justin Jefferson wants $35 million a year at the wide receiver room.
Cha-ching.
It's like it's the wide receiver room, to your point, is ballooning. If a guy like Nico Collins, who's had one good successful season, is getting $24-25 million,
Of course.
what is Justin Jefferson worth if he's even more explosive than that? And so the theory was the Vikings were going to go get Malik Nabers and then look for multiple first round picks to trade Justin Jefferson so that someone else could pay the $35 million. And that's showing that the wide receiver market has a ceiling. There is a number where it gets to where people are saying, well, that's just too much money to invest in one single player on the outside that can't control the game away a quarterback can, or an edge rusher, or a tackle can. And so, Adam, there was a world where the Giants don't have Malik Nabers available to them at 6. And all of a sudden you're asking, is it Rome Odunze? Do they trade back? Are they interested in a quarterback? Like, what happens there? It would have been fascinating to note if the Giants didn't get Malik Nabers, that this whole situation with Darius Slayton and otherwise could look drastically different for the Giants.
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness, man. You said, okay, was JJ McCarthy really a viable option, right? Would they have gone QB at that point? Was Roma Dunze a player that we really liked and we're willing to commit to at the 6th overall pick for the New York Football Giants? Would he have been the selection? Or do you start having the conversations? Who wants the quarterback? We're willing to trade back. And then all of a sudden you start to look at it and construct things very differently for the New York Football Giants, and not necessarily for worse or for better. Just it would have been dramatically different how it played itself out. And I think the fascinating thing when it comes to a player like Jefferson, we know the talent that he is. When your timeline seems to be a little bit off from where you currently are, now all of a sudden the heightened watch is what's going on in camp for Minnesota. Is JJ McCarthy coming along here? Does Sam Darnold look like a guy that's capable of giving you 1 year of quality football? Because I tell you what, man, we saw this with the Giants, right? As only Dave Gettleman could. We're gonna pay Odell Beckham Jr., and then we're also going to eat a large chunk of that guaranteed money and trade him. And the Vikings do not want to do that. It's not just about, oh, if we sign him to the contract, we could always move him. There's guaranteed dollars that get filled in there, and you want someone else to be on the tab for that. It seems insane to be willing to move on from a premier talent. But when you don't feel like you're going to be one of the top 2 teams in your division potentially, and maybe they will, we'll see. But it starts to have this conversation about when you're going to pay. And frankly, if you are Justin Jefferson, you're looking at this and going, I better get my money now. Because as we mentioned with some of these things, it looks like what's about to happen is the NFL is going to have that implicit agreement that, hey, we're going to start to bring down this wide receiver market because nobody gets more money than QBs. That's the only crown jewel of a franchise. And every other position, as we know with running backs and otherwise, you guys get what we're willing to give you. It seems like that is coming here as these numbers and contracts keep ballooning.
At the end of the day, Adam.
At the end of the day, Andy.
We are excited that Malik Nabers is in the room. It gives the Giants a future at the wide receiver.
Yes.
When you have what you think is the wide receiver number 1, it makes it easier to find complementary pieces that could be a 2 or a 3. And so the Giants started at a really good spot. They don't have to pay Malik Nabers for a few years. You hope that the market will maybe correct itself. To me, the Giants are in obviously a significantly better position than they have been in the wide receiver room since Odell Beckham Jr. left the organization. Yeah. And so for me, I'm excited how this works out. There's still a lot of intrigue in this room. We mentioned, will Darius Slayton be here? We mentioned, is it going to be Gunnar Olszewski, Isaiah McKenzie, and what will Bryce Ford Wheaton look like? There are still a lot of questions that OTAs and training camp will inform us of before week 1.
Oh, you better believe it, man. There's a long way to go here. Wide receiver room is one of the narratives we wanted to follow. We've mentioned before running back room. We're going to get back into that. The case for only keeping 6 wide receivers because 4 running backs are going to be deserving of being a part of this roster. We're also going to update as the week rolls on other takeaways, who are a handful of key players that can either solidify their roles or find themselves on the outside looking in as what very much does feel like a transitional offseason for a lot of key positions on this roster. And so You get over to YouTube, you turn on the alerts for One Giant Podcast, you subscribe, see when we're going for some of our live episodes over on X at AMAC214, at Adam Armbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast, and on that podcast feed, wherever you get those needs fulfilled. Until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.